Hi everybody, it's Thomas here from Thomas Fitzgerald Photography, and today I want to talk to you about Fuji shadow and highlight tone options. So if you have switched recently to a Fuji camera, one of the things that you may find a little confusing on it is what the shadow and highlight tone options do. Now obviously if you've been a Fuji user for a while now, you're probably completely familiar with these and there's no confusion, but I've often got questions from people asking me to kind of explain these, and I've written about it before on my blog and it's part of my Fuji JPEG guide, but I thought I would actually show you because if you use Fujifilm X-RAW Studio, you can actually really see the changes in actions, which is what I'm going to do now, and I'm going to kind of explain it a bit. So hopefully this will kind of make things a bit less confusing if you do have any issues understanding just exactly how this works. So one of the things about Fuji cameras is they don't have a contrast control that you might find on other cameras. Instead, they have two options called highlight tone and shadow tone, and by combining the two of these you can actually control the contrast in your image. So for example, I'm just going to take a few images, go through them and just show you the differences, what the different options do, and kind of give you an overall explanation. And hopefully by the end of this you will have a better understanding of how this works. And again, for those people who understand this already, that's great, but there are those people out there who do find it confusing, so bear with me. Okay. Let's dive right in. So here's an image I took in Germany, and it's just it's a typical landscape image. It was like a garden in the city of Darmstadt. And just to say, the images that I am using here, they're nothing spectacular. They're no award-winning images or anything like that. I just picked a few different images from my library that I thought would have features in them that I can use to actually explain this. So in this case, I shot this with Velvia. This is a RAW file, but it was actually going to use the settings that would have been if I had used it as a JPEG. So I have it set to Velvia, and normally the way I normally like to shoot is I have highlight tone set to -1 and shadow tone set to +1. So what that does normally is it adds a little bit of contrast in the shadow areas and also recovers highlights slightly and gives kind of a gentler roll off. You see, what the shadow and highlight tone options actually do is they control the actual response curve in the highlight and shadow areas. So that's kind of hard to explain, but it's easy once you see it in action. So in this example, I have it set to -1. So when you have your highlight tone option set to a negative number, it softens the highlights. It creates a more gentler kind of highlight roll-off, which can have the effect of, it looks like you're recovering highlights. So to show you what I mean by this, I'm going to first of all set this to 0. And you can see that's brightened the highlights. And if I set this all the way to +4, see it's now completely blown them out. It's not the same as complete highlight recovery, but it is very similar. So again, if I set this to -2 now, you see it's brought the highlights completely back in. Now the same it goes in reverse for the shadow tone options. So if a positive value on the shadow tone will actually darken your shadows. So if I set this to +4, see it's actually completely darkened the shadow areas. So if I want to bring the shadows up, you set it to a negative number. See, and that has raised the shadows. And now in this case, I think that personally that's gone too far, so I will set this back to 0. And that's not too bad. Again, if we keep an eye on our histogram, you can see that there's still a little bit, of headroom here, or base room. So I can set this to +1, which is where I had it. And for me, that's kind of fairly straightforward. So if you want to increase contrast in an image, you set your values to +, and if you want to decrease contrast in your image, set your values to negative. But by splitting it, it allows you to control the highlights and shadows separately. So again, in this case, if I had set the highlights to positive, I am actually increasing the contrast here, but it's come at the expense of clipping the highlights. So that's why the advantage of having the two controlled separately. So let me give you another example, just so that we have a few different things to look at and so make it a bit clearer. Okay, so this is another image that has fairly high contrast going on in it. And as you can see, there's kind of this area of the mannequin was backlit. And I have this set to -2, so that's doing a degree of recovery. Now, I probably should have, I probably would have needed to use the dynamic range expansion on this when I shot it, but I didn't actually shoot it that way. Now, the funny thing is, if I actually use the raw file in this in something like Lightroom, you can still recover detail from this, so it's not as big of an issue. But again, because this is quite backlit here, I can give you a good example of the difference this makes. So at the moment, this is set to -2, which is going to give you the most amount of recovery. So if I set this to 0, again, you see it's that bit brighter, but it's not significantly more washing it out. Again, the way this works is it controls kind of the contrast in the highlight area. So if I set this to +4, this will actually wash it out quite a bit. So you can see, but there is still a little bit of detail here, so it's not completely getting rid of it. So again, that's the difference between +4 and -2. Okay, so in the next example, I'm going to show you, I'm going to concentrate more on the shadow area. So let me pick this image. Okay, so this was at a exhibit in the zoo here in Dublin just before Christmas. They had a series of animals made by lanterns all around the park, and it was fascinating to see. So in this case, this is a high ISO image, and it was shot at night. So I have the shadow tone at the moment set to +1. So again, positive values darken the shadows. So if I change this and set it to -2, so negative values will brighten the shadows. And you can see it's brought up some detail in the shadows. Now obviously there's limited here, but you can see straight away that's actually a significant difference. So again, the thing to remember again is it's not clipping the shadows so much as increasing the contrast in the shadow areas. So again, if I go to +4, and this is that has completely blacked it out now. But again, it's kind of a mix of both. And that's part of the reason why it's kind of hard to explain sometimes, is because it's a weird way they have done it, but it seems to work and people are happy with it. So, but it's a bit more complicated than, say, the straightforward contrast control that you might find in other cameras. So let me do one more just to show you. Again, I'm going to take another image with a lot of shadow detail and kind of concentrate on this. So again, this one there's a bit more detail going on, and I'm going to zoom in just so you have a better view of it. Okay, so again, at the moment I have this set to +1 and -1, which is kind of my default shooting. Okay, and so if I set this to -2, you can see that's brought up more information in the shadows. And again, if I set it to +4, you can see that's completely crushed the shadows. And if I set it back to 0, this is kind of neutral. So if I zoom back out now, and again in the sky area here, I have this set to -1. So if I set this all the way to +4, it's going to brighten the sky. And it hasn't completely clipped it, but there's a little bit of clipping going on here. So I always prefer having the highlights set to negative. There are a few occasions, and I find it's usually when you're shooting black and white, and usually with the across profile, it can get a bit flat. And in those cases, you might need to increase the contrast by adding +1. So let me give you one more example. In this case, this is a fairly low contrast image. So I'm going to show you how to increase the contrast on this. So again, this is my default shooting. I have set to -1 and +1. So I'm going to set this to +4. And that hasn't made a huge amount of change because it has only really affected the highlight areas. So again, if I set this to +4 on the shadows, it's going to crush the shadows completely. But because this was underexposed, if I set this to +1, you can see that we have a much greater spread on the histogram now. And there's no real clipping going on either, so I can actually probably get this a little higher. Now it's starting to clip a bit. But again, then we can kind of adjust this. So the problem with this is, when you're shooting like this, this only affects JPEG. So if you're shooting RAW, this has no really effect on it, unless you're using XRAW Studio, which XRAW Studio is really just the front end for the in-camera JPEG engine. So that's kind of one thing to bear in mind as well. So if you're kind of getting caught up on it, just bear in mind that it does only affect the JPEGs. Having said that, I find that it's best to kind of have a good idea, even if you are going to be shooting raw, to you have your image set in camera that it gives you a good idea of what it's going to be like, because otherwise you're going to find it hard to judge. And that is why my preferred shooting method is always -1 on highlights and +1 on shadows. And that's pretty much it. So I'm not sure if I've made this any less confusing or if I've made it more confusing, but hopefully if you've recently switched to Fuji system and you've kind of been a little confused about this, this has made it a bit clearer. So if your camera supports XRAW Studio, and there's only a small number of them that do, and you do want to kind of get a better idea for this, it's actually a really good way to understand it, because you can see the changes as you do it. You don't have to kind of shoot and check your screen and shoot and check your screen. So if you shoot a bunch of raw files and then play with them in XRAW Studio and try all the different options, it's a really good way to get to know the different parameters in your camera. So I don't really want to keep going on about it because there's not really much more to it, but I hope you found this useful, and if you do, give this video a like or a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel, and check us out on Patreon, and we'll see you in the next video. And thanks for watching, and I hope you found this useful. Okay, see you next time.